I often forget this, so I'll put it up front. I want to give you a website and something. If I forget it, ask me about it in the question period if you have time, if you're interested. The website is www.community-wealth.org. Community-wealth.org. And there you'll find chapter and verse on literally thousands of things that are happening in this country that people have found a way to do and are doing, and that can expand on the kind of work you've been doing here. Community-wealth. And in that same vein, if I forget, ask me about some community wealth meetings in which people are exploring as a community in Scranton and in Cleveland and in Tallahassee, which might possibly have application here. So let me say I am really terribly pleased to be here. I take seriously, very seriously, maybe more seriously than some of you, what you all do. I think many people think of the cooperative movement as very important, useful, a nice thing to do. I don't think so. I think it potentially is one of the few places in the United States where the key ideas can be re-nurtured slowly, agonizingly, practically, for what might become the next American transformation. So I want to talk about heavy things, not light things. And that's, I guess it's nice to be in a church, although I wanted to be a rabbi, I think would be better. I never, as any of you, one or two of you may have heard me speak elsewhere, I never use notes and I never read. I don't know why that is. It just works better for me. But I'm going to read something tonight because it's been on my mind very briefly. And I've been thinking about the following as a way of both introducing this discussion and as a way for all of us to maybe think a little deeper about what we're doing. Now, it is true that I worked in both the House and Senate and policy planning in the Department of State at the rather senior level. And I worked for liberal congressmen and liberal senators. I was Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day's legislative director. I come out of liberalism. So I'm going to speak about liberalism a little bit so you just know where I'm coming from. I'm not only a friend of, I am a product of liberalism. When I speak to my liberal friends, what strikes me most these days is they have lost their sense of demand and anger. They might be satisfied with half measures. They don't imagine any longer what could be. They are surprised to think it utopian, and they think it utopian to ask tough questions about big, big issues. The reason for this is that many know that this politics is now weak, and they are trying to do the best they can, with which I deeply sympathize and support. But they no longer have anger or a sense of what they are absolutely right in their demands, and that society as a whole needs to change radically. It somehow is not there very often anymore. What they want now is some amelioration, step by step. I see them now as a resisting growing inequality, slowing it down, resisting worsening environment, slowing it down, resisting war, slowing it down, all of which is important. I affirm it. But it has lost something. And it's up to us, I think, to face that and then ask if there's a way forward. It's a bit different on the other side, and I'm not speaking of George Bush. I'm talking about real conservatives. I respect real conservatives and disagree with them. Part of the reason conservatives, some of them, have strength is that they have the conviction that they are defending Western civilization. Really, they believe that. They are doing what is right. They have moral integrity. The world should be the way they want it to be. They have not lost, as yet, a sense of their own vitality. Part of this, their conviction, and part of it is their theory. And they do have a deep theory of what is required about liberty and capitalism and democracy and how those pieces fit together. It is not a slogan for serious conservatives. Liberals no longer have a deep theory. There is a quality that needs to be discussed. It is a quality most easily grasped by people who recall the civil rights movement. Many here, I suspect. There's a quality of intensity, yet recognition of depth and length and time. It is a moral and political quality, both passionate and committed, yet intelligent and reasoned. There is a similar passion, distinct and arrogant, but nonetheless close in some conservatives. It gives them their edge, and it's this commitment about Western civilization. What I think we need to look at is how we recreate a reasoned, serious passion that can carry us forward with the kind of intensity there once was. Let me say beyond that, I don't think you can get there without it. So, the first thing I'd like at least all of us to consider, if it is true that we need to seriously rebuild how we think and how we do and how we act, both morally and theoretically, that we need to begin to reconstitute a sense of what makes sense, and then ask how, step by step, we might get there. That's a different question than how we get rid of George Bush, how we elect Democrats, how we elect liberals, all of which I'm for. But that's the question I'd like to put on the table, and why I think you guys are so important, to me anyway. Let me begin this way. I'm both a historian and a political economist, and the most obvious thing I think of as a historian is that political economic systems come and go. They do not last forever. Inside the system, it looks like nothing will ever change. It looks like what you see is what you get, always, until it changes. So I don't take seriously the notion that American political corporate capitalism is the last word. I doubt it. Probably couldn't be. But if it is to change, we need first to understand that there might be another possibility. Now, I say that looking at you, and I want to remind you that I'm speaking to the person sitting in your seat. And I am saying, most people don't believe this. Most people do not believe there might be another possibility that could be other than utopian. Ask yourself, no, you really can't make it. Not possible. Too much in the way. Can't be done. It is not possible. Margaret Thatcher coined the phrase TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative. And most of us believe it. I don't. I think it's unlikely that this will last forever, and as it gets worse economically and socially and environmentally and racially, I suspect people will build up and things will change. The question is, what will it look like and how do we get there and what do we want? By the way, that is the question. What do you want? What do we really want? Not how do you elect Democrats, though that's important. So let me say another way of how I think about this and offer it as a way to begin thinking, and I am going to come down to exactly what might possibly be done and what's being done around the country, but I think the context is of the essence. One way to think about it is I'm a kid from Wisconsin. I was brought up in Racine, Wisconsin, went to the University of Wisconsin. If you noticed, I worked for Gaylord Nelson, Wisconsin senator. When I was in high school, Joe McCarthy was around. I'm a little older than I look. And in Wisconsin, McCarthy was tough nationally, but in Wisconsin they shot everything that moved politically. My high school teachers were frightened to say a word. It was devastating. And if you had read the tea leaves of the time in Racine, Wisconsin in the late 1950s, in the mid-50s, what you would have predicted is nothing can ever change. And then the 60s happened. If you had been involved in and concerned about what were not called feminist issues much, but problems facing women from 1918 to roughly 1962, you would have predicted nothing will ever change between men and women and families and roles, because there wasn't much to see. And then came the most important cultural revolution in modern history. It is indeed the most important cultural revolution, the Feminist Revolution, and still is, unpredicted by the experts and most of the people involved. And if you were involved, as I was involved with Gaylord Nelson in what we called conservation in the 1950s and 60s, and talked about environmental issues, what you would find is deaf ears. No one thought you could make environmental issues. It was just not on. You might get a little conservation in the northern part of Wisconsin where the tourist industry required it. But the notion that you could have a large idea politically, and certainly not ecological issues, was not on. And then it exploded, unpredicted by the experts. And most important from my perspective is if you had been a conservative in the 1940s in the United States, I mean a genuine conservative, a serious person, you would have been regarded as ridiculous, antique, unimportant, somebody to mock. And slowly and steadily over 35 years, they built themselves the most powerful political movement in modern American history. I am not a utopian. I do not believe those stories tell us that we can do it ourselves. I do believe they suggest that anybody who says it can't be done might be wrong. Keep an open mind, particularly if you know that history continually wipes away systems and power bases and Rome dies. And of course, there was that thing we call the American Revolution, which took on the greatest empire of the time and knocked it back. So I am a prudent historical optimist. I think things can change, and I'm interested in whether people can get themselves to the place where they see that as the question, rather than how to do a project, though projects are important, rather than how to pass a law, though passing laws are important, rather than electing a person, though that's important, but transforming the most powerful system in the world is the name of the game. Now, those of you who are not interested in that problem, it's time to leave, because that's what I'm interested in. What I see happening and why I take seriously, particularly seriously, the work of people in the co-op movement. And I'm going to come back to why it's important in a special way and why the tradition, I think, is going to come back into its own in a way that it's very powerful. I think the other ideas and other political tendencies are at a dead end. I've begun to sketch liberalism's failures, but I could add, with the collapse of labor from 35.3% at its peak in the mid-50s to 7.4% now in the private sector, 12.4 if you include public service. That trajectory, which has been the base of all social democratic movements in Europe, labor, and in the United States as well, such as it is on the way down. And so, secondly, with the transformation of the South by the civil rights movement, inevitably, as Lyndon Johnson predicted, it turned the South over to right-wing Republicans organized on the base of race. And you see George Bush as the result, in my view, of the decline of organized labor underneath the Democrats and liberals and the takeover of the South. The South was an aberration because Lincoln was a Republican. It was always voting for Democratic presidents on the backs of black people, but so it did. And now that's over, and it is what it always should have been, a bastion of right-wing racist politics which elects people like George Bush, but it is over. You need to pause. This is a very unique capitalism. It is the only advanced capitalism with a major quadrant of the society geographically organized around racism. The red states at the heart are the old Confederacy. There is no other one like that, though there are minor divisions based on ethnicity, which can be exploited by right-wing politicians all over the world. Nothing like this one. And globalization is in the world. Nothing like this one. And globalization is another reason why I think the traditional liberal or social democratic trajectory is not going to rise again. It undermines labor, undermines communities, strengthens corporations. But traditional conservatives are also out of gas. They find a president presiding over an expanding government the destruction of individual liberty, the destruction of community. Serious conservatives took local communities seriously. The destruction of small business and the rise of the corporation, and huge deficits as far as the eye can see. Something is going wrong. Let me put it in a different way. The two great 20th century traditions in the United States, liberalism and conservatism, are at a dead end, in my view. Really. Really. Which means the reconstruction of the next set of ideas is on the table right before your eyes, and it's our responsibility to build it. There is no way forward the old way. Well, you can put it a different way. If you don't like capitalism and you don't like traditional socialism, what the hell do you want and how do you get there? That's the name of the game. Or where do we go in the 21st century if you're interested in equality, democracy, ecological sanity, and peace? Where do we go institutionally if you believe giant corporate capitalism is the center but not the only driving force behind some of the problems we face, as I do? And what do you want? Even in theory, what do you want? Go back to those conservatives I was talking about, the ones with intensity, conviction, theory. What do you want that would be any better? And tell me why. We have a huge task. Simply to begin to suggest some of the elements of an alternative vision and why it would be better. The conservatives were right about centralizing too much power, you know. They were right about that. But nonetheless, we know that the ownership of capital is critical, and they were wrong about that. By the way, you know what the numbers are on the ownership of capital in the United States, and why one of the issues is how to go beyond, in my view, corporate capitalism. The top 1% now has more income than the bottom 100 million people taken together every year. It's actually more than that, but that's a nice round figure to keep in mind. The 1% has more income every year, far more, than the bottom 100 million people taken together. 1% owns just under half of all the business, financial, and investment capital in the country. 1%. You have to think about that number. 1% owns just under half, it's 49.7, I think the last number, of all the capital. That's the corporate capital of business. That's the heart of the political economic system. It is medieval. Technically, I'm not trying to slur it. That's what it is. It's a medieval formulation. The last time they ran the numbers, 1999 numbers, and it's probably about the same now, the top 0.2 of 1%, 0.2 of 1% made more money on the sale of stocks and bonds, 0.2 of 1% made more money on the sale of stocks and bonds than everybody else in the entire society taken together. Last year, the top 1% had 57.5% of the dividends, rent, and interest payments. The name of the game is who owns the society, one of the central issues. And that's a rough picture of who owns American political economy today. And you don't have to be a radical to know that with that kind of money goes power. That comment, by the way, was made by a conservative friend of mine in a recent talk where we appeared on a panel. You don't have to be a radical to know that. Everybody knows that. That's common sense, grassroots political science and history, and common sense. But if that's true, and you're interested, say, in democracy, to say nothing of community or liberty, then the ownership of capital becomes a real question. Now, there are only 4 or 5 alternative ways to do it. There is the socialist state, which has its own problems. There's the giant corporation, which has its own problems. There was, in the 19th century, an entrepreneurial base, some of which, in a very fragmentary way, still exists and can be very useful and helpful and part of the community, but it's not a system-changing alternative. And then there were always in American and European history a set of ideas about different ways to organize the political economy. Usually they involve radical decentralization of ownership. Usually they involve collective or cooperative principles. And usually they involve democratization in decision-making. And usually they involve somehow anchorage to the community. That's the ground rule. It's not the end, it's the ground rule. The co-op was the most important of these. The co-op was important because it had two other elements. It took its principles seriously internally. I gather from your recent survey that the most important reason people are interested in your co-op is because of its principles, not because it has cheap food. Interesting. And it had politics traditionally. In Scandinavia, in Wisconsin, where I come from, in Britain, and I gather you folks don't have much of that, but that's something I don't know much about. But traditionally, the co-op had larger visions of how we transform society. Most important, it organized practical ways to organize economic institutions. That's a big deal, particularly in a society that doesn't have alternatives. The other forms, guild socialism was one of them, involved workers owning, not co-ops, worker ownership, or guild socialism. And that was another way to get at this, because worker-owned firms are much more responsive to the community. They don't get up and go to Mexico. They are part of the community. They get affected by the same environmental problems. They live with the neighbors. They're more accessible to the community. And the third one was city, municipal socialism, which is very common in the United States. Lots of businesses owned by cities in the early part of the century. And another piece was the state ownership. In my state of Wisconsin, you can still get very good insurance from the state, and state-owned public insurance, much cheaper, much better. In the state of South Dakota, there's a big state bank. Several of these still exist from the early part of the century. They're state-owned, not huge national institutions, but very practical, very practical. Well, my book is about all of this in much more detail, and so is that webpage, but if one of the elements, if one of the necessary elements in rebuilding a sense of where we want to go, one of them is changing the way we own economic institutions in a practical, serious way, then we need to reconsider the possibilities not only of co-ops, but all of these institutions. The interesting thing to me, and why I'm not a utopian, but a very practical person, but a historian, I think, in developmental terms, is over the last 35 years, there has been the development, little bit unknown to most people, partly because the political economic system just isn't solving problems, and partly because some of the people of the age of many here, including me, came from a time when they wanted to have their politics mean something and are now older and have skills and time and potentially could be very serious actors, I think. Made things happen, and they still are happening. But let me give you some things that have been boiling up underneath the surface that give me a sense of what might be possible. There are, you probably realize, 11,000 companies in the United States that are owned wholly or substantially by the workers, up from 300 35 years ago. You didn't notice? The press didn't tell you? It's extraordinary what's happened in the development of employee-owned companies. Many of them good, many of them bad, lots of problems, but a very big developmental path. And, I'm a historian, enough experience, if you look seriously at it, and I ask you to think this way with me, so that on the basis of 35 years of development, we actually know something. This is not airy-fairy theory anymore. I can tell you, if you want to do it here, I can tell you who to call and he'll be here tomorrow. Practical, knows how to run the balance sheet, knows how to set up the corporation, knows how to do the training. Hundreds of people like that all over the country. On the basis of that, the next stage can be built in that movement, in my view. There are something like 4,000 neighborhood corporations operating, up from 0 in the 1960s, some good, some bad, CDCs, but other nonprofit corporations. Some very interesting ones, there's one in new communities in New Jersey, something like $300 to $400 million in business a year, 1,600 employees. They use the profits for medical care, et cetera, in the neighborhood. There's another one in Harlem about the same size. There's a lot of bad ones. There's good experience, bad experience, and what are these? Nonprofit corporations designed to serve communities, which are also practical business. They do a lot of housing. Probably there's a lot of housing here. That's one of the primary areas. But there are people go well beyond housing. And they illustrate another grassroots form of economic activity with a service mission. Mayors all over the country, including grassroots Republicans and grassroots Democrats, are now putting cities back into business. It used to be called city socialism, municipal socialism. It's called the enterprising city now. But it's being driven by the failures of the system. The fiscal crisis is forcing these guys to say, we better start setting up our own businesses. For instance, in Boston, there's major investment in real estate by the city, owning the real estate to turn the profits over to the city for services. 40% increase from what you can get in taxes because you own it. Many, many cities doing that, and the press probably didn't tell you about it. There are cable television, there's Wi-Fi service, I gather you're doing that here. There are hotels in a dozen cities that are owned by the city. There are, most interestingly, let me tell you about Riverview, Michigan, but there are 400 cities doing this. They capture the methane from the garbage, the city, turn it into gas for electricity, make money selling the electricity and provide jobs and use the money for services. That's socialism, municipal socialism. That's springing up all over the country because the other alternatives are failing. There's something driving this. It ain't just good ideas and people saying we ought to. As a historian and as a political economist, that's the thing to keep your eye on. It's not just good ideas and good folks. It is the context is beginning to demand solutions to which the politicians can't give answers in the existing system, and it is forcing, but opening the way for people to get serious at a different level. State public pension fund investing to keep jobs in cities and even to invest in worker-owned companies is on the rise all over the country. It isn't just California and CalPERS. The red state of Alabama is doing this, investing in 200 worker-owned firms to keep jobs in the state. The state of Alabama, public investment in worker-owned companies to keep community. What in the world is that? The model that you see in that last sketch is of a larger public institution, in this case a state, outlining the economic forces that it would need to build and support a different form of organization at the local level, practically. That is a skeletal outline of an alternative to capitalism and socialism. Did you notice? Look closely. That is radically decentralized, community building, decentralized, yet supported by large upper-scale institutions which have the community as the base. Now, it isn't Alabama. I would not make Alabama the be-all and the end-all. It's just interesting that even a red state is attempting that. If you look at the state of Alaska, I'm sure you know this one as well, Alaska takes 1/4 of the revenues from oil sales, 3/4 go into the public top till, the rest goes into what they call the permanent fund. The permanent fund invests those and provides to every individual in the state of Alabama dividends as a matter of legal and constitutional right. Everybody. Check that out. The state is the economic engine, owning the capital, and not in this case as in Alabama or California or New York or Wisconsin and Minnesota, helping build new forms of organization at the grassroots level. It is owning the capital and directly providing resources to individuals. In the year 2000, as a matter of legal right, constitutional right. In the year 2000, if you were a man and a couple with 2 kids, 3 kids, 5 people, $10,000. As a matter of legal right, that was the payout in that year. It goes up and down. That was a fairly reasonably high year. That most years are around that now, and it's going to go up. Another interesting thought, a skeleton outline in the United States of America in 2006, right before your eyes, of a state reorganizing the way in which capital is owned and using it for a very different purpose. You have to look at those things. In my view, you can begin to see the skeletal outlines of something very decentralized, yet cognizant of the power that might be needed at the center, highly democratic, or potentially so, potentially community building for targeting, and maybe doable over time, slowly going forward, maybe. I'm not a utopian, as I said. I think this is being driven by necessity now. So one of the interesting questions is if, as we build a necessity, I'm talking to all of you in your seats, me too, we were to take ourselves, this is the hard part, if we were to take ourselves seriously, if we weren't simply doing good things, joining a co-op, making it work, environmentally good food, if we were actually thinking what would it take, let's lay a decade on the table, or maybe two. How would you get from here to there, supposing the context is forcing people to realize that the old ways don't work, that they're not able to do what they once said they could do, that there's a lot of pain, that there are things building up that could be built upon the 30 years and maybe we could begin to build the ideas of a different vision that was practical. Maybe we could do what most people do in history. I remind you, this is the way it's done. Who do you think those people were who started the civil rights movement? Like half a dozen kids who decided to sit down. Do you think they're any better than balls in our court? So as I said, I take you all very seriously, and the reason I take the co-op movement so seriously is the following. Of all of the interesting models, that's what the website's all about, of all of the interesting models, it is the only one historically to be very, very serious about the organization of its internal principles. Many of them are interested in owning capital or anchoring jobs or money and so forth, but the co-op movement had a different vision. And it has reached a certain maturity in my view. I'm not an expert. I think the co-op movement, the modern co-op movement, went through a phase of getting very political before it was ready to walk, not taking care of business. My sense is that many co-ops now know a lot about taking care of business and doing it in a principled way. I've been around the country many, many places recently, and I hear people just beginning to realize what they could do from what they have already established and looking at each other and saying, what would it really take? And supposing we had a meeting, and supposing we thought about the next 10 years, and supposing we thought about at least three questions. How do we expand, intensify, deepen our own and expand others? How do we begin to think about this city, this community, and what we could, if we got serious, do to build forward towards a different vision? Other people have done it. And even more interesting, whether we could begin to take ourselves sufficiently seriously so we began to develop theory. That's where the energy comes from ultimately. Because if you just believe you're doing a project, you do one thing. If you believe you're doing good, you do another. If you can begin to develop something intelligent that says if we proceed this way in these stages, we might actually be doing something real, that's where the energy comes from. I remember I was up in Cambridge at Harvard during the Vietnam War. You could look out on the grass along the Charles River in the spring of 1967, before the anti-war movement, before Martin Luther King decided he could take the risk and be against the war. He didn't until 1967. It's too frightening and too dangerous to the civil rights movement. In that spring, you could see the kids playing Frisbee and lying out there and getting sun, and all the co-eds and the kids flirting. I mean, just a wonderful spring. And then, one day, They were gone. They joined the anti-war movement almost overnight. It was spectacular. Many Latinos and Latinas have shown us, boom, 500,000 people in the streets. You think there's something not brewing beneath the surface in the United States? The question is whether we have something serious to begin to develop that means something. And I mean means something in terms of transforming the larger scale institutions which this country is dominated by and which if we don't change, will repeat and repeat and repeat. So that's a heavy rap. That's what they used to call it in the 60s. That's a heavy rap for those of you who remember that term. But I think that's where it's at. And I'm a prudent optimist. Very prudent. Remember, I've been involved in very hard-headed, hard-nosed politics in the House and Senate and Washington and all that stuff. I know how the game's played. I'm not a naive kid, and I'm not an academic in that sense. I think there is a realistic, cool possibility that the people of this era have the possibility, if they get serious, of laying the foundations for achieving the possible next American transformation. I didn't say that we have the possibility of achieving it. I doubt that. I said that we might lay the foundations, possibly, for what might become the next American transformation. People like us, nobody else. Margaret Mead has this wonderful, wonderful comment. Some people think small groups don't do anything. Little groups are the only thing that ever gets anything done. That's how it all starts. I'm talking to the people in your seat. It's a heavy rap. My heroes, those of you who know anything about the civil rights movement, my heroes are the people working in Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s. Great things were done in the 1960s when there was a movement. It's easy to join a movement when there's a movement. Very easy. The real work was done when it was really hard to do in the 30s and 40s, much harder than any of us face it. They would hang you or kill your kids. So, the name of the game is, you want to throw, if you want to play this game, you got to throw, the chips are a couple decades of your life. It's a long game, but it's a real one. For the first time, I find this the most interesting period of my adult life. It is the first time I see real possibilities with sufficient development, and to use an academic term, the slow beginnings of the delegitimation crisis, people no longer believing the old stuff, looking for answers and not finding them. It is the first time that I see the possibility of fundamental change, maybe. Now, we are also hammered in by the language we use, so let me give you a piece of language that I find useful. We often think of reform as, and this is liberalism and social democracy, the giant corporations are there because they dominate the political economy, and we clean up around the edges by passing regulatory and social programs without touching the heart of it. That's reform. The institutions don't change. Revolution is the other term. The institutions get overthrown and we get a different outcome, often with disastrous results, sometimes improvement. The kind of process I'm outlining to you is probably best termed evolutionary reconstruction. The steady build-up over time of the elements which then become, at the right moment, capable of moving things to the national level. By the way, that's how the progressive era achieved all it's achieved. It all started locally. That's how the New Deal did it. It all started locally. The New Deal just captured stuff that had been developing for 30 years at the grassroots level. And I suspect that's how the transformation must proceed, because you need to know something real, how to do real things. Then they become the basis of longer-term transformations. So, I've talked too long, but I want to say one last thing. Then I'll sit down. Chairman Mao used to say that the power came out of the barrel of a gun. I don't think so. I think the American women's movement in the 1960s, those of you who are as young as I am, demonstrated that a half a dozen people getting together, reading, and talking to each other over coffee in somebody's living room built power. Extraordinary power. So I'm going to say the hardest thing that I want to say to you all, my kind of challenge to you, this is the hardest thing I've said. You know, I've said all these heavy rap things, right? The hardest thing I want to say to you is I propose that some of you get together and read and think about what you could do really. Now, I think that's very hard to do. People don't want to do that. They prefer not to. The second hardest thing to do is to say, can you change 1 hour of the time you allocate in 1 week, once a month, to this kind of stuff? And I'll bet most of you don't want to do that. I certainly don't. But the suggestion is that the problem is not the system. Sorry about this. It's not the system. It's us, whether we existentially are willing to rise to the challenge. The least that happens if you rise to the challenge is you will probably improve life in many communities, even if you don't get what you want, because there's a lot of good work to do. And just possibly, like those people in Mississippi, we all may rise to the challenge of laying down what is needed for that transformation. Thank you very much. You're okay, yeah? Thank you.
My question, encompassing everything that you said, which made me feel great when you said it. From the first thing that you said about there's not enough passion about change. Democrats, just sort of going along. My question is, do you have a theory about how leadership is developed?
Do I have a theory? I thought I said one. No, I mean, I think people can, if they decide, you and me, call a meeting and get 6 people together and talk about what you think we could do if we got serious. Period.
Sure, that's how we used to do it.
I think that's the only way you can do it.
So what do you do in today's world where everyone's running faster than they can?
I don't believe that, because I've been traveling around the country, and lots of folks are getting busy and doing busy things and doing good political things. I've been laying out tons of the stuff.
Is there a database of these people?
Yeah, well, see, this, for the sort of things that I was talking about, there are many different groups that have many political things. I mean, your resources here, Mark can probably fill you in on all the interesting things going on politically, but the ones on economic matters, which is the heart of the matter from my point of view, www.community-wealth.com. And you'll find tons of things people are doing in this busy time.
I'm between computers right now, so I can't do it. But I will in about 3 weeks.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
First, I want to thank you for inspiring us once again to think big about alternative forms of economic organization. Those of us who are participating in co-ops or ESOPs or social movements like trade unionism or feminism sometimes feel like we're little Davids up against ExxonMobil, Citicorp, and these giant corporate Goliaths. And I'm still puzzling as to how we can get together as little Davids to form something that can actually confront those corporate global giants. I just came from the New York demonstration with liberty, it's a kind of a mockery of the Pledge of Allegiance, with liberty and justice for oil. I wonder, how are we going to confront those giant corporations?
Well, I think the pattern, it seems to me inevitably, is walking, what the Chinese used to say, walking on two legs. One, there is need for political confrontation, political attack, political challenge, and they are creating reasons for people to be more and more angry at them. So I think there are openings. Let me also, I should have mentioned this. In many states, this is just an example of what I'm talking about, this income distribution thing has gotten so outrageous. In many states, people are beginning to do what are populist taxes, not liberal taxes. What is that? Liberal taxes traditionally, I'm exaggerating quickly, tax the white suburbs to pay for the central city. That's over. That's the 20% being taxed to pay for other people. Populist taxes are taxing the top 2 to 3% for the 98%. That's a politics that's very different. California last year, they passed a tax, increasing the taxes on people making over $1 million using the money for mental health care. In New Jersey, they passed a tax people over $500,000 and used the money to offset low and moderate income real estate taxes. In Connecticut, there was a millionaire's tax proposed, 67% for it, 73% for it, 67% of Republicans for it. It didn't quite pass, but it led to, in the bargaining, a new estate tax increase. Those are all taxes aimed at the extreme elites. The name of the game there is, Karl Rove wants to turn the middle-class suburbs against the low and moderate income people using race as a divider. Our game is to get the 95% together on serious proposals, like these tax proposals. So that's one piece. Yes, confrontation is necessary and it needs to build up, it needs to be dealt with, and the war will be stopped. It will be stopped by building up. Secondly, the alternative, though, is building not little, lots, getting the hard work, rolling up your sleeves, getting the alternative structures built steadily around the country out of which the politics comes. That's what I'm arguing, that you need to consider rebuilding the institutions. And that is a process which, as I've said, is underway and can be developed and can become part of a politics all over the country. Let me give you another example. In Ohio, where there's a lot of worker-owned companies because of the big steel crisis led to consciousness raising, they have now got support from the state government, as many states do this, but in Ohio it's very interesting. If you try to get a big company to come in most states it's $70,000 to $100,000 per job in tax giveaways. And they would have come in, the study showed they would have come in anyway. It's a fraud. They just play the states off against each other. If you provide technical assistance to the workers to buy out a retiring owner, which is thousands of them, it's about $500, mainly per job, mainly legal stuff. So I'm suggesting a walk on two legs. Yes, the confrontation is necessary as they continue to create pain, but what's really important is creating an alternative structure that can become transformative. If you want a metaphor, the last place a guerrilla warfare wins is at the center. You build up in the periphery, step by step by step by step, and the center falls. Now, I'm not a utopian, because all that decentralized building is positive anyway. But just possibly, if you're going to get there, you build in the periphery before you get to the metro.
I have a very brief question. How do we vote?
I'm sorry, say it another way.
We're in terrible danger. There's no one to vote for. There's sure small elections, but I mean, when we think about what's happening in this country, we are lost. We feel lost oftentimes. We
Yes.
are awash in what's going on. It's crushing.
Yes, it's true. And I think it is crushing. She's absolutely right. We are no longer in a democracy in that sense. That's the reality. Not quite as bad as Mississippi, which was changed by people working hard and taking big risks, but very, very, very difficult. So, I speak as a historian. The question is whether or not we can build power over time, slowly, steadily, agonizingly, to turn that around. I don't think there's a shortcut.
presentation, very, very inspirational. And especially your discussions of the nature of social change, which is a topic I've given quite a bit of thought to lately in conjunction with another issue, which is the peace issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you. I think we're about to enter a transformative period, not just in U.S. history, but in world history. And I think that your analysis of what it takes is the group. There's a book I recommend everybody here, if you haven't read it already. It's Adam Hochschild's book called Bury the Chains. It's a story about 12 men met in the spring of 1787, right when our founding fathers were meeting to create our Constitution, and decided that they were going to abolish slavery in the British Empire. And it was decades later, after some initial successes and some dramatic failures, and finally success, I think it was late 1830 or thereabouts, when there was still one of those 12 people still alive, they succeeded. But my question is sort of a reply critique, and I haven't read your book, so I don't have the advantage, but everything else you said is so wonderful. I'm suspecting you'll have something answer. I wonder if it's more than an American transformation that's going to be required, if it isn't just going to be really a world transformation. I base that on a couple of things I'm reading lately by John Munsell, UNCL from London, and also George Monbiot. They argue this. They say that what we're faced with in this country is no choice in what's to focus. In fact, the governments themselves are totally strapped. They're totally boxing on corporations who are threatening to take jobs elsewhere. If they make any changes at all. So left-center policies, left-center parties have to move to the right side.
I believe you're right up to the last sentence. It is an international crisis, but I can tell you tomorrow, if we organized our power, you can stop all that in this country. Tomorrow, this is the richest country in the history of the world. It is the least globalized of any of the countries. It has a very small export and import. The globalization sector compared with France, Germany, any other country. If you wanted to do it, we can sit down and talk policy. That book I gave, that Mark mentioned, the policy recommendations. And the globalization problem is not about globalization, honey. It's about who's got the power. And if you want, we can sketch the decisions it would be possible to make in a democracy to stop all this crap. That's not hard. Policy-wise, the power is the question. So I'm sorry, I feel very strongly about this one because we tend, all of us, tend to say, you know, it's really a problem out there. I wasn't saying you were. It's the globalization. Notice how fraudulent that is? And who gets to avoid responsibility? Has nothing to do, I'm exaggerating now, has nothing to do with globalization. It has to do with you and me. If we organize to stop this nonsense, it will stop. This is the richest country in the history of the world. It's $170,000 now for every 4 people the economy is producing. This is not a poor country. $170,000 now for every 4 people, every family of 4, if you divide it up to GDP. This is a rich country. You tell me we can't organize ourselves to stop this nonsense? It's a power problem. And beneath the power problem is the institutional problem. How do you change the institution? When I worked in the State Department, we'd come up with wonderful programs to help third world countries. And by the time you got the money out, the corporations had beat you to the punch and it was all junk. You must deal with here. We need to, in my view, we need to deal with ourselves before we can deal outside. And that we have a responsibility for. So I'm very tough about the globalization stuff. I think it's way overdone, and I think it's a way to distract us from what we can do. Sorry about that. As you can see, I don't like that one.
I just wanted to remind you, those of you who have questions, try and keep it brief or to let others have an opportunity. We'll take one up front and we'll take one way in the back.
This is the 5th largest city in the country. Yet I think I can count on one hand the amount of consumer co-ops
Right.
that are in existence. It seems to be like Philadelphia exceptionalism, that we this way have not been able to replicate the success that we have had for over 25 years. So how do we move from this successful entrepreneurial experiment that has really improved this whole neighborhood to really creating the political demands? And maybe I'm answering my own question, but perhaps you have some comments on it, because we It just sits there. So how do we mobilize ourselves and create that?
You are pretty much answering your own question, but let me give you just a little. What's happening in Tallahassee and Cleveland, these are all at planning stage right now in Scranton. You can get the mayor even, I don't know about the mayor here, or you can get the city council even, or various organizations, different organizations, to say we want to have a day in which we bring to the community all the possibilities that exist all over the country. We just did a big Aspen Institute conference on this. What could be done in Philadelphia? And bring in the people, we have to go look on that list, bring in the people who are doing great stuff to do not only co-ops, though co-ops is a big part of it, but worker-owned companies and land trusts and municipal, all the things that are being done. This city could be vibrant. That's the pitch, and it's true. But the bottom line is, you got to organize it. You know, it's like everything else. You just have to get to work. So but we also have very interesting places in this time of history because we have skills, knowledge, we know how to do things. Many people come out of an era when they had ideals. This group of people is really important if we took ourselves seriously. Finding a way, not a crazy way, but a serious way. I'm not sure I can give a full answer to it, but let me tell you how I think about it. The other book that Mark mentioned, the books I've written about nuclear weapons and the bombing of Hiroshima and I've worked in the State Department, you know, in the policy level. Here's how I think about the question. If we don't blow ourselves up, which is possible, these guys are crazy. What I see, and this is a painful hope, actually military expenditures are just about 5% of the GDP now, which that's very large in big numbers, but it is a declining, recently it's gone up a little bit, but over time it was 14.2% in the Korean War. It averaged 10% in the 50s. It was at 7.2 in the 60s. It was down to about 6.7 in the 70s. There's a declining share of the GDP in the military. It took 26,000 and then 50,000 American lives in Vietnam to stop the darn thing, 2 million Asian lives. We're at about 3,000 and people are fed up to here. I think there is a growing unwillingness of Americans to send their kids to die for this stuff. And if we can avoid nuclear war, which is not, I think the end of this empire, like other empires on the military side, may happen. That's the trajectory I hope for and work for, and I think many people here work for. But it is not a it's very painful, but it's a process historically which may very well allow us more space. Let me put it another way. During the first quarter of the century, the second quarter of the century, the third quarter of the century, Vietnam and Korea, First World War, Second World War, Vietnam and Korea, and a lot of little wars, public was diverted and money was diverted. When we can stop diverting the public to security and diverting the money, to the extent that happens, the domestic problems become much more central. And I think we are on that trajectory as France and Britain were before us and as all empires are because of the pain levels. But it's a very painful trajectory. So that's a gloomy hope. Okay, thank you. Thank you.